and welcome to the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and I'm joined today by a very special person to me. You might know her from previous episodes of the podcast, Kimberly Carfore. Kim, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be back on.
Well, I'm really happy to have you back on. And usually, when you're on or when anybody else is on, I'm interviewing you about your work in the field of religion ecology. And this time it's a little bit different, and you'll be interviewing me. So, anybody who noticed our most recent episode with the Reverend Dr. Nancy Wright, she recommended somebody interview me. She's like, I think there's more to hear from you. And so, get somebody on here to interview you. And I mentioned I've had some episodes where I do talk about some of my work. And she's like, yeah, but you can't just talk about yourself with yourself. It's kind of one of those things of if you're a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, you can't psychoanalyze yourself. You need somebody else to do it. And so I thought that's a great idea, and I'll have Kim on here to kind of talk to me about what I do. And it is one of those things I've actually gotten um, that feedback a lot from many of the people I've interviewed. Is they'll talk to me and they're like, anyway, what about you? And I'm like, well, it's not about me. It's putting the spotlight on you. And they're like, yeah, I'd like to hear more from you. So I thought this time, okay, let's go ahead and do it. And so happy to be interviewed by someone who knows me so well, knows my work really well, and who lives in the same apartment with me.
Yeah, that's
So
me.
that's you. So
Yep.
anyway, so take it away, Kim.
All right. Well, I feel like I'm gonna hold up a mirror. So if this is spotlights, I'm gonna hold up the mirror and then the spotlight is now on you. And so kind of like what you said, we'll get little tidbits here. You'll talk about your work, but as you were talking, I'm thinking about this phrase in academia, which is research is me search. And so, you're always researching things that are of interest to you for one reason or another. But my goal is to kind of scratch the surface a little bit, right? You've talked about your work, so I wanna see the man. Is that the man behind the mirror? And a man in the mirror. That's Michael Jackson. None of these metaphors are landing, so it's okay. Great interview so far.
We're doing good.
So I am going to start out by asking you, like I said, putting the mirror back on you. So a question that you often have for your guests, your podcast guests, are, how did you get into this work? And so I want to ask you, what is your origin story, or how did you get into not even the field of religion and ecology, but why does this field make sense to you? Why have you found a
Mm,
home in this work?
right. Uh, yeah, that's a good question because I'm not very autobiographical most of the time, and and so I don't think I've shared too much about my journey into this field or into this kind of this work. And I don't know where to start. And that's one of those things, a lot of the guests I have on, I'll kind of mention sometimes it starts in early childhood for people, sometimes it's in grad school, it's any number of points. And so I've been involved with it a lot since explicitly since like 20 years ago.
Mm.
And that's when I started to become aware that there was a field of religion ecology. I met Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm in 2006. And so that's when I started to really explicitly engage with this work. But before that, I can see traces of it from early childhood onward. Um, Part of it was I blame my dad a lot in a really good way. But the ecological side of things, like I was camping before I was conscious.
Mm,
And I've seen pictures of me in a tent, and I'm like, I don't know who that was. It was some like
mm,
3-year-old kid, and so camping, hiking, fishing, hunting, that was a big part of my life from like the age of like 3 to like 16 or something.
mm,
Family trips and those kind of outings,
yeah,
and so just exposure to nature was part of my life.
yeah.
And on the other side of things, the religious side of things, I was raised Catholic and was, I guess you could say, obsessed with it. Um, and at the age of 8, when people ask me what I want to do for, like, people always ask you what you want to be when you grow up. That's a classic question you ask kids. And when I was 8, I said the Pope, which still holding
One
out for.
day.
Yeah, one of these days, fingers crossed, might work out. Of course, Pope Francis is the first Pope from the Americas,
Mm,
from Latin America.
yeah.
But my
Yeah.
parents were like, I don't know that there's going to be a Pope from the United States. And still to this day, I'm pretty sure that they are correct about that. Not in a
Uh,
long time are we going to see Pope from the United States, because popes from the United States would probably not be good at representing global concerns.
hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
another question about the state of Catholicism in the United States today.
Huh.
And whereas a pope from Latin America or Africa, or
Hmm.
even Pope John Paul II, right, from Western Europe, it's a different story there. So that was a big part of it. Philosophy was a big part of my upbringing as well,
Hmm.
because I think sometimes, like, my parents would like have bedtime stories and things like that for me, and I think sometimes my dad like ran out of bedtime stories, so he'd just tell me about philosophy. And so I would learn about Rene Descartes or Saint Anselm or something like that. And so I was taught the ontological argument for the proof for the existence of God, right?
Hmm.
That if God is that, then which nothing greater can be. Like, you can't conceive of something greater.
Hmm.
And you think, well, is it greater to be or not to be? Well, it's greater to be. Well, if God is that, then which nothing greater can be conceived, and it's greater to be than not to be, God must exist. And so I was taught that when I was like 5. And
5 before going to bed too. So
yeah,
your 5-year-old mind is kind of going to dream world as in this philosophical mindset. So who knows what your unconscious was unpacking at that age.
yeah. And so,
That's
like, I was raised as like a philosopher and a theologian. I was raised as somebody who had regular contact with nature.
mm,
So that was just kind of in it for me.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and then I went to
yeah.
college to study philosophy, and happened to land at a college that focused on environmental ethics, in particular, the University of North Texas. And I wasn't interested at all in environmental ethics. I just liked philosophy and
Mm,
religion, and still to this day have trouble separating those.
yeah.
Because if you study like South Asian philosophy, you're studying Hindu philosophy or Buddhist philosophy. So the boundary between philosophy, theology, religious studies, that's always been a very permeable one for me. And then gradually got hooked on the idea that environmental ethics was, in fact, the most important issue
Mm,
facing humanity.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so then when I did my doctoral studies, I was explicitly interested in thinking about that, thinking about environmental ethics, eco psychology, religion ecology, those kinds of things.
Hmm. So then how does eco psychology come in? So it sounds, as you're talking about your upbringing and kind of putting on my psychology lens, it's like, wow, during those critical periods of formative times, you weren't really making decisions. It's like this is how your mind just was developed. So these ideas from religion and ecology just kind of were natural to you. And I think you did an episode thanking your dad, but um, it's just fascinating to hear this kind of cohesive narrative of how his perspective was so formative for you.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And then kind of branching out on my own in college, uh, some of it was the philosophy I was reading,
Hmm.
and that if you just dig into philosophy very deeply, you start to realize that philosophy of nature is core to any tradition.
Mm.
But especially, I was focused
Hmm.
on what we would generally call the Western philosophical tradition, which is a bit of a misnomer. But people like Plato and Aristotle, the concept of nature was really central to their thought.
Hmm.
And then there's a pretty strong through line from Plato and Aristotle up to Romanticism, existentialism, postmodernism, these kinds of movements. They're all still dealing with that inheritance. Um, and so for me, it was in particular Martin Heidegger, who's a notorious philosopher because of his affiliation with the Nazi Party in Germany. And but I was reading Heidegger before that was super publicized.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I didn't know, I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't realize how deep into that he was, and some of the ideology, the anti-Semitism, the racism, etc. But I saw a philosopher who was deeply concerned with connecting humans to earth and to
Mm,
place. And that this isn't just, even if there wasn't a climate crisis, even if there wasn't issues of toxicity and pollution and mass extinction, it's still a question of finding your true essence in place.
mm,
And so just taking philosophy to the limit, to its own end, whereas a philosophy is fundamentally a way of connecting to earth.
mm,
And so it wasn't about like an environmentalist activism kind of thing. It wasn't about responding to an environmental crisis. It was just like the truth of our being
mm,
is our being on earth as mortals,
mm.
which also connects to gods and things like that. And so, not to get into a whole Heidegger lesson, but um, so that was a big part of it for me. Was just like the more that you read philosophers, the more you see that thinking about the truth of our existence is a question of the our bodies and our earthly condition.
Right. So, as a philosopher and someone with a philosophical mind, you were uh, the deeper you got into theory and specifically with Heidegger, it's almost like place-based identity or a philosophy of nature was the deepest way of thinking. Is that kind of what you're saying, or am I?
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. And I remember feeling kind of embarrassed about that because um, I wasn't interested in environmentalism as a social movement at all.
Mm,
And like a lot of people in conservative places in Texas, like where I was growing up, not only is that not something you want to do, it's something you're going to laugh at and ridicule.
yeah.
And so there was something kind of very embarrassing and humbling about realizing that, in fact,
Mm,
that is like the work, or as Thomas Berry calls it, the great work of our time,
yeah.
right? Is reinventing the human in a way that reconnects the human to its terrestrial context and
Mm,
larger cosmic context as well. Um, so yeah, that was a big part of it for me. And these days, there's not a lot of Heidegger in my work, but I mean, one of the most recent books I published on co-existentialism,
hmm
I'm still engaging Heidegger's work, but more the people who draw on him. People like Jacques
mm,
Derrida, Timothy Morton. There's all kinds of people who draw on Heidegger that are able. It's like Heidegger was like he's fascist, but if he's a fascist piano, there's ways to play that piano that are not fascist. They're in fact anti-fascist, anti-colonial,
yeah.
anti-racist, anti-sexist. And so then it's just a question of learning to play it in a different key, learning to play different tunes on it.
Yeah.
So still deeply indebted to Heidegger's work. Um, so it was part of it. I mean, I think the other part, I mean, one of the reasons I came out to the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco to do doctoral work was because Ralph Metzner was there.
Right.
And it was Ralph Metzner's work on eco psychology, or what he calls green psychology, that was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
Mm,
This is what I should do for a doctoral dissertation. And that's a complicated intersection of a lot of things. People might know Metzner because he's a student of Ram Dass and Timothy Leary,
yeah.
and wrote the psychedelic experience, which is their kind of psychedelic translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so that was very formative for me. And the idea of getting to study with this person meant the world to me. And then other writers along the same line. I mean, Terence McKenna is another important influence for me. And these were people that were very much grounded in psychedelic experiences, but saw the connection that if you're having these kind of mystical experiences with psychedelic substances, right, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT, that doesn't just cash out in terms of some kind of spirituality, but also in terms of the connection to earth. And
Mm,
so folks like McKenna were explicit that, like, well, if the future of our culture is psychedelic, it also needs to be feminist. It also needs to be ecological. It also
mm,
needs to integrate world religions perspectives, not just Christianity. Like we need Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous thought.
mm,
And so I was very influenced by that. Um, and some of my own personal experiences with psychedelics as well were very formative, but particularly in the context of these writers helping guide your interpretation of those experiences.
hmm Right.
Otherwise, I mean, geez, some people take psychedelics and get really into conspiracy theories.
Yeah, a lot of them do. Yeah,
That
this is
seems to
true.
be a problem.
Yeah.
And but luckily,
Anti-vax.
yeah, so I had the right interpretive context for it, and the
Yeah.
right hermeneutics. Um, and then I come out to San Francisco, and it turns out that Ralph Metzner is retiring, and nobody told me that when I was joining the program. They're like, "Well, he's got one semester left," but luckily I was able to take a few classes with him. They were very amazing, and then who shows up in the second semester I'm there? Mary Evelyn Tucker and John
Mm,
Grimm,
okay.
because they were at that time working with Brian Swim to craft the Journey of the Universe project. So they're out there kind of doing some work on Journey of the Universe. And they're like, well, we'll guest teach a class. And so they had a class on world religions and ecology. And I knew of them because anybody coming out of an environmental ethics background, of course, we are very aware of their work. The books that came out of the series of conferences at Harvard in the mid '90s were just really seminal works: Christianity ecology, Judaism ecology, Hinduism ecology, etc. And so I was like, of course, take that class, and then
Mm,
had a great time in it, and and we clicked, I guess you could say. And so that summer, this was spring 2006, and then that summer they offered me some intern work to help update some of the bibliographic material on the website. And then about 19 years later,
mm,
still working with them, and a couple of years after that, also I that's when I started teaching at the University of San Francisco,
mm.
teaching environmental ethics and the course on religion and the environment, and been teaching there ever since. And
Nice.
so now it's like all I do is
Yeah.
focusing on religious and ethical perspectives on the environment.
Yeah. Great. That's such a great and kind of robust arc telling your journey. And so some of the threads that really stood out to me are this idea that, one can have mystical experiences, but the set and setting really matters, or, it's not about the spiritual journey or spiritual connection isn't about these mystical experiences per se. Because I know some people that just kind of um that's the goal, is to kind of have these mystical experiences. But it's almost like, okay, well, um, if you pick up the phone, God calls, you pick up the phone, and then you hang up, and then what do you do with that? And so it sounds like you kind of have this framework, whether that's coming from Terence McKenna or eco psychology from Ralph Metzner, religion ecology from Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, right? So it's giving you this framework to help kind of contextualize that mystical vision. But that seems really related to the theory behind eco psychology and even kind of Buddhist psychology, right? Because I know that you came out to California initially because you wanted, I think it was Stanford, you were interested in studying the connection between Heidegger's philosophy and Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy, which, as you're telling your story, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're to kind of deconstruct the self in order to open up to one's place-based identity or place-based connection, that's very connected to kind of that Buddhist sense of self. The emptiness is at the core. So I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit about that. I guess the connection to Buddhism, maybe, because has anybody asked you about your kind of Buddhist philosophy or how that connects to eco psychology?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, I want to hear it then.
So yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I'm not very confessional about my relationship to different religious traditions because I try to be just pretty open to everybody. I like them all.
Yeah.
And but in terms of my own personal life, being raised Catholic was one thing, but yeah, I took a pretty strong turn toward Buddhism in my teens and 20s.
Mm,
Taoism was in there too. Um, and so because of that, Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism was kind of my favorite side of things, which is very influenced by Taoism, right? Buddhism makes its way to China, encounters Taoism, and then something emerges out of that encounter that's kind of Taoist, kind of Buddhist. Some people even do argue that Chan Buddhism is a Taoist response to Buddhism, that it wasn't a Buddhist response to Taoism, it was a Taoist response to Buddhism. Anyway, these two things hit each other, and then Chan emerged, of course, in Japan that's called Zen. Uh, so yeah, I was really interested in that, and taking up meditation practices, reading Buddhist texts, and to me, and there's a lot of literature on the connection between Buddhist thought and Heidegger's thought. And even though Heidegger himself was very Eurocentric, um, he had some indication that Buddhism had some stuff to offer.
Mm.
But other people have noticed that there's connections, despite the fact that he wasn't drawing on Buddhism explicitly. And so, yeah, I was really interested in diving deeper into both,
Okay.
and reached out to some people at Stanford. Thomas Sheehan is a great Heideggerian scholar that was at Stanford at the time, and so I reached out to him, and he's like, "Yeah, you want to study Heidegger with me? Great. I don't do Buddhism." And then there were people
Yeah.
at Stanford doing Buddhism, but they didn't do Heidegger. And so the hyper specialization of academia kind of reared its ugly head. And I realized I couldn't do the kind of integrative
Mm.
thinking that I wanted to. And I'm not sure if I would have gotten in the first place. And so, as good of a student as I was always pretty interdisciplinary in terms of philosophy, religious studies. I did some work with linguistics, ethnomusicology, anthropology, and so all over the map. And so a very hyper specialized, narrow disciplinary framework. I'm not sure that that would have worked for me, even if I wanted it to.
Yeah.
But when they were like, "No, you have to pick one. You can't do Buddhism and Heidegger here."
Yeah.
And so I was like, "All right." And then some of the reading I was doing, some of the experiences I was having, I really felt that the California Institute of Integral Studies was more my thing. Even though somebody like Ralph Metzner wasn't engaging with Heidegger, he was engaging with the Western philosophical tradition as well as Buddhist thought and Hinduism, environmentalism, uh, transpersonal psychology, psychedelic studies. And it's like, okay, here's a place where I can study all of these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so still to this day, I don't consider myself a Buddhist. I really don't consider myself much of anything.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
but when people talk to me, they hear Buddhist
Buddhist.
ideas.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's almost like the Buddhism comes out using different definitions or different framework. But the Buddhism, the essence of Buddhism seems to be the specter of Buddhism is surrounding your work.
yeah,
So that takes me to my next question. So you kind of tiptoed around it, but I know that your first book and your dissertation was on integral ecology, this concept, which the Pope now uses, but you said it first. Uh, although, you're getting that from a handful of other people as you define in your book and in your work. But in terms of kind of your current spirituality or your spiritual practice or your religious stance, how would you define one for the audience, or how would you describe yourself?
yeah. I mean, that's a good question. It's a fair question. I don't describe myself,
Mm,
and I'm very suspicious of the kind of expressive individualism that would ask people to identify their position.
mm,
And I don't think I need to. I don't know what's gained from that.
mm,
And like, if I want to receive communion at a Catholic church, I guess it's important to identify as a Catholic and that kind of thing. But do I
yeah.
need to tell anybody that? And I don't know that anything is gained by that, but I can imagine that something is lost, because if
Mm,
I'm going to claim allegiance to one tradition and not another, like, what is falling by the wayside when I do that? So if I
mm,
say I'm a Buddhist, does that mean I'm not an existentialist? Does that mean I'm not a Catholic? Does that mean I don't have solidarity with indigenous people?
mm,
And so I basically try to be open to everybody's perspective and try and learn as much as I can and think deeply and be committed to
mm,
certain causes. But like, what's my relationship to the ultimate ground of being? Like, it's complicated.
mm,
And I mean, keep in mind also that the term Buddhism is not a Buddhist term. Like, the Buddha
mm,
Dharma is a real thing, but the ism, that's actually imposed from translators. And same with a lot of these isms, Taoism, Hinduism. And so it's funny, I had a student come up to me the other day asking me like what I believe. And I don't know
mm,
what I said in class, But I think it was one of those things where I switched. I was kind of doing a journey of the universe, kind of Brian Swim thing about how like all the matter and energy in our body is ultimately 13.8 billion years old, and it's been flaring forth the whole time, transforming and mutating. But that's how old you are, right? And
Yeah.
when you say how old you are, and like, oh, this age, like, well, technically you're about 14 billion. And then I pivoted and I was like, also, we're all made in the image and likeness of God, Genesis 1:26 and that kind of stuff. And I
Yeah.
think that student was like, wait, so you're saying that we're like the product of evolution, but you're also saying that we're God's children or whatever. Like, what do you believe? And I was like, I believe all of it. There's nothing I don't believe, but I try to believe the best of it. Because
Mm.
obviously you could be Christian
The core.
and be like a fundamentalist about it. Like, no, I
Yeah.
don't agree with literalist interpretations of the Bible. I think that's terrible on a lot of fronts. Um, and and then likewise, like Buddhism or something like that, I'm like, well, I can't recite all of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. Like I don't have that memorized. So am I really a Buddhist? Am I
Mm.
meditating enough every day? Am I part of a sangha? Like, no, not really. So I'm not
Yeah.
going to call myself Buddhist. You're like, well, you're Catholic, and so you're raised in the Catholic tradition, and so you have baptism and confession, communion, confirmation, and confirmed in the Catholic tradition. But do I call myself that? Like, no. There's reasons to resist it,
Yeah.
especially in the very right wing United States, where Catholicism is often weaponized in a way that currently, especially, is used to attack Catholic charities, to attack the Pope, um, and to attack immigrants. And like, I don't know that I could call myself a Catholic at a time like that when
Mm.
I might want to be a fierce critic of Catholicism, but also supportive of it because Pope Francis is doing amazing things in terms of encouraging people to care about immigrants and to care about our ecological crisis. And so, like, I'm averse to labels, which is why I wrote a book on existentialism, because existentialism was one of those labels where nobody liked it. Kierkegaard never called himself an existentialist. He talks about
Mm.
existence. There's only a few existentialists that ever use that term, but for the most part, people really resisted it. And so I'm like, I don't like a label, and somebody's, there's a label for people who don't like labels, and it's existentialist. But even then, I'm like, but existentialism was so humanistic and individualistic in so many ways. Just like lots of problems with that. I wouldn't agree with it. So yeah, I don't like putting a label um, on my beliefs or my values or my sense of spirituality. Uh,
Mm.
and I realize that's a kind of a cop out. Um,
I don't know if it's a cop out. As you're talking, I'm just picturing this elusive spirit that is, you know, moving to the core of kind of like perennial philosophy, right? You're moving to the core of all traditions and seeing the core goodness and believing in that kind of truth. But
mhm.
also, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about this idea of practice, and I know this might be an annoying question. Um, but as you're talking, right? So I can see because your orientation is a philosopher. And so part of why or how people can consider themselves a part of one tradition and not another is one, a belief system, and two, a community of practitioners, right? So there's the belief system, the community, and then the practice. And so where do you get kind of what is your current practice in terms of connecting to your elusive, non-existentialist, mystical position?
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, that's very probing. And that's, I guess, again, the reason
That's why it's an
that,
annoying question.
yeah, and that's the reason why I'm having you interview me, because I would never talk about that on my own. Um,
You don't have to answer anything, but
oh no, of course. Yeah. And I'm definitely not saying anything that I don't feel comfortable sharing, but I am I'm sharing things I wouldn't have shared if not asked, you know. And I mean, right now I have a tourmaline bracelet on, so crystals for my practice, and so everything. And again, yeah, speaking of the perennial philosophy, I try to um, practice in any way I can, any practice that's relevant. I try to adopt. Um, and For instance, earlier today, doing the laundry here in my apartment, I was getting the laundry from the dryer, and then which is a separate room, right? And then because it's not in the apartment, there's a laundry room at the apartment complex. And then coming back, I was trying to pay attention to gaps in my um, inner monologue because we're always talking to ourselves and thinking about things, and there's always this constant inner monologue happening. But there's gaps in it. You're not always talking to yourself, are you? And
Mm,
every little gap, you feel the non-conceptual dimension of reality showing itself, the non-verbal, non-conceptual,
mm,
just pure mind, you could call it, or you could call it matter. The mind matter dualism falls away when there's no inner monologue.
yeah.
And so, just walking, holding laundry, noticing the gaps.
Yeah.
And then you notice those gaps long enough, the gaps start to widen. And then you can
Yeah.
have not just moments, but a whole experience where the non conceptual dimension of reality can show itself.
Mm,
So, something like that, which you could say is very Buddhist or Taoist or Christian. And I mean, also, I mean, somebody like Thomas Merton is an inspiration to me because he's a contemplative Christian, cared about environmental issues, also had his own translation of Taoist texts, was very engaged with Buddhist thinkers as well. And I'm like, that seems to be the way to do these things. It's all the same practice in a way, and just different languages or different inflections, different versions of it. Um, so, yeah, something like that,
mm,
just trying to pay attention to
yeah.
things. But also, pretty much every morning, I do a mindfulness practice before I get out of bed. And what does that mean? It means that I pay attention to being in bed.
Hmm.
And a lot of us don't like pay attention to it. We get up. You wake
Yeah.
up, so you get up. Like, well, before you get up, why not actually be there just
Yeah.
for a moment or maybe for a while, especially if my cat is sleeping on top of me. I don't want to disturb her. So I use that as an opportunity to be there, and or even in the shower. You know, I
Yeah.
took a shower today, and there's a moment where I'm like, okay, stop showering and start being present to the reality that you're showering.
Mm, hmm.
Let the
Hmm.
water be water, and instead of letting it just be this activity that I'm doing, so try to put a pause on the doing and the
Hmm.
having, and let being show up.
Mm,
So I
hmm.
try to do that in all aspects of my life, because we're given constant opportunities for that kind of practice.
Yeah.
And in terms of relating to other people or other animals or plants, then I think that's what we would call love
Mm,
or compassion.
yeah.
And again, different languages, and they're all different. And so I hate to smash them together because I'm not trying to homogenize these different traditions.
Mm,
Uh, but very much, I am very influenced by the idea of perennial philosophy,
yeah.
that ultimately there is one truth. Every tradition is expressing it, every practice is expressing it, but in a different language. And there's that
Yeah.
old idea that there's different paths, but they all go to the same summit.
Yeah.
There's one mountain peak that we all get to. And I don't think it's like that.
I was
I,
waiting for the curveball.
yeah, I think that there's one ocean and there's different shores. And so if you're in
Mm,
Japan, if you're in Hawaii, if you're in Seattle, if you're in San
mm,
Francisco, we can
hmm.
all see the Pacific Ocean. It's the same ocean, but it's a very different view.
Yeah.
And so what's the view I'm cultivating? I'm not sure, because it's not exclusively a Buddhist practice or a Christian
Yeah.
practice, or a scientific practice for that matter. Thinking of like the universe story and Brian Swim's work with Thomas Berry in that regard. Like,
Mm,
yes, some of it is just seeing like a scientist. Some of it is seeing like a Christian. And
yeah.
then is it a contemplative Christian? Is it a mystic Christian? Is it a Catholic? Is it a Protestant? Like, I'm not I'm not sure, and I'm not too worried about that.
Hmm.
I'm just trying to enjoy the view of the ocean.
Mm.
And maybe when I finally get there, I can tell you exactly what my path was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it's one of the reasons I'm so inspired by Thomas Berry, because he's somebody who obviously was a Catholic priest, but then found the truth in all traditions, including all religious traditions, indigenous traditions, feminist thought, science,
Yeah.
and like, yep, they're all right.
Yeah.
They're all correct. There's the truth to all of them. And then how do you live that truth? This kind of integrative truth?
Mm.
Like, well, this is unexplored territory. We've never been in a situation as a society where people have been able to learn all these things.
Yeah.
I mean, right, like
Yeah.
around 100 years ago, a big debate among scientists was whether or not there are two galaxies in the universe. Like, well, we got a Milky Way. There might be a second one. And then 100 years later, like, oh, it's trillions,
Yeah.
trillions. And each galaxy is hundreds of billions of stars. And here's our galaxy, and we have this one star called the sun. And so, I mean, it's look at how much we've learned in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I do like the term integral ecology for that
Hmm.
reason,
Yeah.
because it's an integrative perspective. And ecology is just about one thing, it's interconnectedness.
Hmm.
And that includes the interconnectedness of organisms and environments. It also includes the interconnectedness of our cultures. And so I'm trying to practice interconnectedness.
Mm. Nice. Yeah, as you were talking, I'm picturing kind of everybody looking at the ocean from their shore, and that brings me back to this place-based identity, which is such a different metaphor than the typical kind of there's a top of the mountain, which can seem very kind of hierarchical and kind of feed back into that sort of universal dimension of the divine or God or whatever, which it can be problematic. So I really like that image that you posed to the audience. Um, so I have a couple more questions, but one of those is going back to this idea of practice. And I know you've said to me in the past that one of your practices is developing an ecological self. And so I think that's really related to what you've been talking about. So maybe you can share a little bit about the ecological self with the audience.
Yeah, definitely. And I was really influenced by Alan Watts when I was like late teens, early 20s. And he articulates to me what is still one of the best metaphors for how a lot of us think of ourselves is that we're a skin encapsulated ego.
Mm,
And that basically it's easy to think of yourself as this kind of uh, as like a consciousness existing like behind your eyes, driving your body around. Right? There's a little ghost driving around the machine, and it turns out no, that's not yourself. That's a really narrow construct, and some of this is just modern individualism. You can see some of it going back to folks like Rene Descartes talking about the cogito, the I think, and that there's a thinking thing inhabiting the body. And of course, that's kind of a narrow reading of Descartes. There are other folks like Jean-Luc Marion who says, well, Descartes actually understands the unity of the mind and the body. You just have to read it carefully. So, that's a whole aside. But we're not just what's inside of our skin. And I mean, even now we're both breathing.
hmm.
And, about maybe two-thirds of the oxygen on the planet is generated from phytoplankton from the oceans. And so, like, phytoplankton are my body.
Hmm.
And how do phytoplankton photosynthesize? It's because they're synthesizing photons and they're taking light and turning that into their body. And so then isn't the sun my body? And of course, somebody like Thich Nhat Hanh was really good about this, doing meditations where he'd hand out apples to everybody. Take a bite of the apple. Okay, it's the apple tree, and the apple tree. How does the apple tree make apples? And it's because it's gathering nutrients and water from the ground. It's gathering sunlight from the sky, and you start to feel this kind of sense of cosmic interconnectedness, and you realize that your skin isn't um, the boundary you thought it was, and that we're actually much more permeable than we might think. And so when I look at the sun, I'm looking at my body, and again, body and mind, that dualism really falls away in a lot of these. Because what is the mind but the activity of the body?
Mm,
which is the old like definition coming out of like Aristotle, that soul is the activity of the body. It's not like a separate substance.
mm, hmm.
And so it's all the non-conceptual dimension of reality, and that extends throughout the whole universe. And that's one of those things that I was interested in when I was like 18, and reading people like Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and Terence McKenna and that kind of uh, psychedelic gurus, you could say.
Yeah.
And it was all fun and games then, and then gradually it's become a burden because
Mm,
now I hurt a lot because
mm,
I feel so connected to things.
mm,
And so when people say something about a species that's endangered or an ecosystem that's being destroyed or immigrants who are having trouble having their basic human rights and civil liberties attended to, it hurts a lot. And I was like, oh, I wasn't ready for that. I thought it was intellectually interesting to be like, oh, it
mm,
turns out my body is actually the size of the universe. Oh, that's cool. And it seems like it'll be fun to feel that big. And it is. It's
mm,
extremely empowering, but also extremely painful.
mm.
And so you need practices to deal with an incredible amount of suffering,
Yeah.
and in a
Yeah.
way that doesn't try to transmute the suffering into something that feels good, but in a way that activates a sense of compassion. And so, of course, like
Mm,
Tonglen practice in Tibetan Buddhism is something that's been beneficial to me, where you learn to breathe in the suffering and exhale compassion. You learn to feel grateful that you can be part of that kind of suffering.
oh, wow.
And your heart breaks, but it breaks open so wide that you can hold space for the whole world.
Mm.
uh, so yeah, so that's there's a bait and switch with a lot of spiritual practices,
It's true.
where they're like, hey, come in here, it'll be really fun.
Look at all
And
this great stuff we have.
get
Look at these mystical visions.
yeah, you get visions, you have amazing experiences. Or think of like tantric practices, or like, it's sexy, don't you like sex? Be like, I like sex. And then it turns out it's like, no, it's a lot of heartbreak and compassion and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
No, you tricked me.
Ha-
So I definitely got tricked, like so many people. Um, but yeah, extraordinarily grateful for it, and do recommend to anybody who's not practicing to really try to cultivate that sense of an ecological self.
Mm, yeah.
This self that's a node of interconnectedness in the whole universe, the
Yep.
kind of image of Indra's net, right?
Yep.
The whole universe is a network, and every node in the network reflects the entire network. So every single gem reflects the entire universe. And intellectually, it's very stimulating. Emotionally, it's devastating.
Yep.
And
That's true.
but that devastation is a very beautiful place to be. And if you're strong enough to withstand it, then that devastation will help guide you into being more compassionate and kind, and making the world the more beautiful place that we know in our hearts is possible.
That's so beautiful. I would completely end there, but selfishly, I want to ask one more question just to keep it going a little bit
Yeah,
longer.
sure.
Because I think you did such a great job of kind of exploring your origin and kind of the foundation of how you built your connection to religion and ecology. And then you created this beautiful arc of, okay, well, who are the people and the philosophies and the religious traditions that you're thinking with to kind of build some of these the concepts behind it. And then you have the practice that continuously keeps you connected and driven and aligned with this vision. And then all of a sudden it turns a corner and now you're hurting all the time, which is so that, like you said, the bait and switch to a lot of spiritual traditions. I'm thinking of the work of Mariana Kaplan, who's talks about halfway up the mountain, where if you find a bunch of gurus saying like, here, come in the door, look at all these great visions, here are these mystics that can levitate, and you can see this fireworks in your eyes or whatever. And then you do that for a few years, and then all of a sudden it shifts to something different. But yeah, she talks about how these gurus A lot of them are just halfway up the mountain, which is weird because it goes back to that mountain metaphor. So, which is why I drew out the beauty of your more kind of everybody looking at the ocean from their different lands. So to kind of just drive it home and end, I want to know what drives you, right? Because if you think about this sort of um, being aligned with identifying with the oneness and then moving into this ecological self. So then what drives you to keep doing this work or maybe to keep feeling into kind of as John Seed says, uh, I am the rainforest protecting itself. You've embodied that. And so what now? I mean, maybe you just continue practicing, maybe you just continue building the framework so that other people can find a home in religion and ecology.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, what drives me is to keep podcasting. Um, and that's what gets me up in the morning. No, I mean, it's a good question. And the John Seed reference is great, right? A great deep ecologist and activist. And you're like, well, what drives you? He's like, I don't do anything.
Mm,
I'm compelled to do this. And so what am I going to do? Stop doing that? I can't. Um, it's not up to me. These aren't personal choices.
mm,
Um, and I don't know when, but at some point I lost the ability to make personal choices. And again, speaking of like transpersonal psychology
yeah.
and eco psychology and stuff that Ralph Metzer is working on, um, that at a certain point, it's not. I mean, as the Apostle Paul says, right? It's not I that live; it's Christ that lives through me.
Mm,
And so, yeah, I don't know.
mm.
And I honestly, I'd like to stop and and just do whatever normal people do, and where you don't
Go drink margaritas
worry.
on the ocean.
Yeah, right. Uh, so yeah, what what drives me forward? It's just like, well, at this point, it's not me,
Mm,
and so I don't know. I do know that some things were driving me forward that have eroded because of this other thing pushing me, because it's the universe or it's Christ or it's Buddha nature or the Tao or whatever.
mm.
Um, the ultimate ground of being, as Paul Tillich would say, which is a very Heidegger inflected term. Um, Academia doesn't drive me like it used to. There was a minute
Right.
where I was
Yeah.
interested in academic success,
Yeah.
getting a tenure track position or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, Partly maybe because of some anxiety about job security, maybe some anxiety about being seen as a legitimate scholar.
Yeah.
Because if you're just an adjunct professor, you're not a legitimate professor, you're not a legitimate thinker. And so I think there was some anxiety about legitimacy and job security and stuff like that. And now I do not care about that at all. Um, and so if anybody's been keeping up with my publication record, they'll notice there's been a steep drop off in the last couple of years. And I've kind of stopped working on a lot of academic publications, still doing some stuff.
Yeah.
Generally when I'm very called to do it. Uh, and But yeah, otherwise, increasingly, I want to learn to think and speak and feel and act in a way that is in accord with this ecological self moving through me, or the great work, as Thomas Berry calls it, this process of transitioning away from our destructive presence on the planet toward a period of mutually enhancing relations with the whole Earth community.
Mm.
So that is now taking precedent at a level um, where academic concerns don't, and so it's infected my teaching a lot.
Yeah.
Where I speak from the heart a lot more. I speak
Yeah.
basically as an activist and an advocate a lot more,
Yeah.
and try to really bring a certain energy to inspire people, to inform them of the dangers that lie ahead of us as well as the opportunities. And so I feel like I've been a more effective speaker, more effective at interviewing people for the podcast, more effective as a teacher,
Yeah.
but I haven't learned to write again. because my writing is still so colonized by academic methodologies. So that's something that maybe will change in the future, but I don't care,
Yeah.
because let's face it, the um, like academic writing isn't changing the world. And so I'm more interested in being an effective speaker and teacher, and
Yeah.
maybe writing will come back in the future. But yeah, I just want to keep uh, letting this move through me,
Yeah.
and to let me be a vessel for whatever creativity is trying to emerge in the universe.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. I was gonna say justice definitely drives you, and you definitely are driven by empowering the next generation to be change makers. Kind of speaking from your own experience, I see that in your teaching. And so just kind of wanted to reflect that back to you that there are some forces that are kind of moving through you that I see, because I know you quite well. And I definitely think that justice and peace are driving you.
Yeah, and so many big nouns, whether it's the cosmic Christ, love, justice, peace, and of course Cornell West right makes a great comment that justice is what love looks like in public.
Yeah.
And so, how do you bring love into legal systems and politics and things like that? Well, we're going to call that justice. And so, yeah, in that regard, I'm also very inspired by the work of deconstruction,
Mm.
because deconstruction is justice, despite the fact that people think it's just critique or nihilism or any number of things. It's one of the most misunderstood philosophies in the history of philosophy, partly because Jacques Derrida wrote weird. And so it's kind of his own fault. But it's also that he was writing in a way that addressed the real complexity of these topics. And it's easy to say, let's do the work of justice, but it's harder to admit that that's impossible. And
Mm.
if it was possible, we'd have a just society right now, but it's not. And so it's this ongoing, never-ending process of trying to approach it. It's kind of an asymptote where you get closer and closer and closer, but you'll never get there.
Yeah.
Because the moment you get there, more people are born into the world. There's other species. There's always more problems. Something is kind of broken about
Mm.
reality, and which is part of why it's beautiful, but also why it's suffering.
Yeah.
And dukkha and Buddhism, sin and Christianity, whatever, is something that's like it doesn't quite fit perfectly. And so, yeah, focusing on the ongoing, never-ending approach to love and justice is certainly a big part of what motivates me,
Mm.
or
Yeah.
peace, or whatever you have it. But it's that thing, like when an opera singer sings a perfect pitch note and it breaks a glass,
Yeah.
perfection would ruin everything. And so there's something imperfect about reality. Dukkha is
Yeah.
a good example because it's like we call it suffering, but it means something like disjointedness or unsatisfactoriness. And and so yeah, I want to stay in that gap.
Mm.
That gap where things aren't perfect,
Hmm.
where the sin is, where the dukkha is,
Yeah.
and keep paying attention to it, keep
Mm.
minding it. Like they say, if you're at a subway or something, mind the gap.
Mind the gap. Yeah.
There's always
That's
that
funny
gap.
how, yeah, how mystical that is.
Yeah, right. Once you develop mystical perception, it turns out everything's mystical, and and you start to see it everywhere. So yeah, just trying to keep purifying my vision, and to do my little part in this grand symphony,
Mm.
without trying to be too grandiose about it. I'm just some
Yeah.
guy.
Well,
Uh, but yeah, that's what I care about. And so
beautiful.
still angling for that Pope job that I
That's what
wanted
I
when I
was
was a
gonna
kid.
tie it back to, Okay, so we haven't had a pope in the United States, but then this goes back to the problem, right? So maybe we can see like our lives as phases because wouldn't you have to be a practicing Catholic for people to vote you in to be the next pope? What are the
Yeah,
rules there?
there's some serious rules. Also, I don't think being married helps.
Okay, yeah, well, that's,
there's,
ooh,
there's,
yeah,
there's
okay.
all kind
Well,
of rules.
maybe you can, no, I don't want you to found your own religion where you become the Pope. That seems very weird and culty.
Yeah, and sometimes I get students who ask if I'm running for office,
Okay.
Because sometimes I will speak in a way that's inspirational about our current moment and maybe have some political wisdom to share. And no, I'm not running for office either, at least not now. I don't think of myself as a writer. I don't think of myself as a politician or a religious leader. I think of myself as a teacher,
Beautiful.
and that's the work I do, and that's what I want to keep doing.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think that's a really great note to end on. I feel like we explored so many different territories, but I love landing on this identity, for someone who doesn't want to identify as anything, that you find meaning in your work as a teacher, which I definitely see with your students. So,
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. And that is a good point because I'm so resistant to so many labels. But that's probably the one that I don't resist.
mm,
And also, I mean, there's something kind of could seem kind of paternalistic about saying you're a teacher. So I would want to emphasize that I'm always trying to teach myself as well because I don't know what I'm doing. And so I'm not the one who knows telling people who don't know. I also don't know. And so trying to be open to all the teachers around me and also trying to
yeah.
teach myself.
Yeah, but there's a difference between being in front of a classroom and not knowing, but teaching them all that you've known because you've done life longer than them, you've studied, you've read more books than them. So you sharing your knowledge, even though you can admit that, as a someone who's committed to the work of, kind of the Duridian impossible, where the work is never done, right? You can align yourself with that, but also kind of look back and see, okay, well, this is when you turn back and share your wisdom with students that you are teaching. I see both sides. I see what you're trying to say.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, because it takes a long time to know that you don't know things.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I so not a false humility, as much as just indicating the ongoingness of the project, and that I do hate a lot of dominant forms of pedagogy where the teacher is an authority.
Right.
And so I'm very interested in like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and these new forms of teaching.
Mm,
People are into ungrading and stuff like that.
mm,
So yeah, there's ways to teach that aren't about imposing authority, but are about uplifting people and undoing a lot of the hierarchies and privileges that normally mark academic education.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah,
Beautiful.
that's what I do. And thanks for agreeing to interview me. It's kind of mean to put you on the spot and be like, hey, ask me some questions about me.
Well, it's so funny as we're tying up. I realize have never been the person to tie things up. So I'm like, I don't even know what those cute key phrases are. Like, all right, well, thanks everybody for being on the show. I didn't prepare those. So I guess I'll make something up. So thanks so much, Sam, for agreeing or responding to, was it Reverend?
Yeah, the Reverend Dr. Nancy Wright, who is, if anybody's paying attention to this episode, it was the episode before this. And so, yeah, it was her idea to go ahead and, because I guess maybe she could sense something under the surface. She's like, you got more story to tell. I'm like, I wrote
Yeah.
books. She's like, no, who are you?
Yeah, well, the book
And
sometimes can be a protective layer, so good for her for prodding and knowing
yeah,
a very gentle way of bringing you to the foreground because I
well,
know
she's
that's
somebody who
not
did
easy.
she was involved with some Jungian analysis back in the day. And so
Hmm.
has that perspective of kind of transpersonal psychology and stuff like that, knowing like, okay, you need somebody to kind of prod and poke a little bit. So yeah, I appreciate her suggestion and appreciate your questions and already regret saying what I've said.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, you can always just edit what you don't want to be revealed.
No, that's more work than it's worth. And so yeah, I hope folks enjoyed this. And if not, I hope you would have turned it off by now. Uh, and otherwise, yeah, we'll be back with other people being featured in the future. And you won't be hearing so much from me for a while. But
Hmm.
we might do this again sometime. And a kind of state of the Sam report.
State of the Sam, I
Uh,
love it because we are
state of the
always
podcast
changing.
host. But I'll tell you what, here's a way I like to end lately, and I'm going to make you close it out.
Okay.
And I did this for Nancy, right?
Okay.
On the last episode. Let's end with a word or a phrase. It can be a phrase. Sometimes one word is very limiting, but just any word or a phrase, and that'll be the way we close out the episode. So give us a word or a phrase. I know, and I know that's a lot. That's a huge burden. But any word, any phrase, and then that'll be the end for us.
The work of justice is impossible, but it is our drive towards the impossible that drives justice. That's a tautology.